A big rover aims to be like U.P.S. for the moon. A small company, Astrolab, announced a deal with SpaceX to send a robotic version of its transport vehicle to the lunar surface and help deploy other companies' payloads. A rover the size of a Jeep Wrangler is heading to the moon, and it's going to need a big ride to get there. Astrolab Inc., the tiny startup that is building the rover, shows the biggest ride possible. Starship, the new giant spacecraft under development by Elon Musk's SpaceX rocket company. On Friday, Astrolab announced that it had signed an agreement with SpaceX for its Flexible Logistics and Exploration Rover, or FLEX, to be a payload on an uncrewed Starship cargo mission that is to take off as early as mid-2026. This is SpaceX's first commercial cargo contract to the lunar surface. Yared Matthews, founder and chief executive of Astrolab, said. SpaceX, which did not respond to requests for comment, has yet to announce that it is planning this commercial Starship mission to the moon's surface, headed to the South Polar region. Astrolab would be just one of the customers sharing the voluminous cargo compartment of the Starship flight, Mr. Matthews said. Mr. Matthews, an engineer who previously worked at SpaceX and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, founded Astrolab less than 4 years ago. Located a stone's throw from SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California. It has about 20 full-time employees, he said. Although the Soviet Union in the 1970s and more recently China have landed robotic rovers on the moon, the United States has yet to send any. NASA did put wheels on the moon with the moon buggy that the astronauts drove during Apollo 15, 16 and 17. Next year, NASA is sending its Volatiles Investigating Polar Exploration Rover, or VIPER, which is to search for water ice in the lunar South Polar region. That is the area that astronauts will explore in the coming years as part of NASA's Artemis program. By contrast, Astrolab's moon trip is, at least for now, an entirely commercial venture with no financing from NASA. Mr. Matthews declined to say how much it would cost to get Flex to the moon or how much money Astrolab has raised. He said Astrolab would make money by lifting and deploying cargo for customers on the lunar surface. That could include scientific instruments. In the future, the rover could help build lunar infrastructure, essentially providing what I like to call last-mile mobility on the moon, Mr. Matthews said. You can kind of think of it like being UPS for the moon. And in this analogy, Starship is the container ship crossing the ocean, and we're the local distribution solution. A robotic arm on the rover can help set up the payload on the surface. The mass of the rover and all of the cargo will be more than 2 metric tons. The Flex rover is a bit larger than NASA's Perseverance rover on Mars and much faster, with a top speed of 15 miles per hour. Mr. Matthews said Astrolab already had several signed agreements for payloads. That appears to be part of the expanding potential market for Starship. SpaceX plans to use it for launching its second generation of Starlink internet communication satellites. 2 flights that are to go past the moon, but not land, have already been chartered by wealthy space tourists. Mr. Musk's long-term dream is for a fleet of Starships to carry settlers to Mars. For NASA, Starship is how its astronauts will land on the moon during the Artemis IE mission, currently scheduled for 2025. Before that, SpaceX is to conduct an uncrewed flight to demonstrate the capability of spacecraft to get to the moon and set down there in one piece. If those schedules hold, the commercial cargo mission with the Astrolab rover could take place the next year. Astrolab hopes a later Flex rover could win future business from NASA, which is turning to commercial companies to provide lunar terrain vehicles for astronauts, essentially a 21st century version of the Apollo moon buggy. Much larger companies like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin are also expected to vie for the contract. Chris Hadfield, a retired Canadian astronaut who advises Astrolab, helped with some field tests of a passenger prototype of the Flex rover near Death Valley in California. So it's not just a really cool concept, but it is now already a very heavily tested vehicle, he said. Farther into the future, the company has even grander visions. Ultimately, our goal is to have a fleet of rovers both on the moon and Mars, Mr. Matthews said. And I really think I see these vehicles as the catalysts ultimately for the off-Earth economy. NASA's Perseverance rover lands on Mars to renew search for extinct life. Perseverance's arrival extends the successful U.S. landing record on the planet and brings sophisticated tools to the hunt for alien life. NASA safely landed a new robotic rover on Mars on Thursday, beginning its most ambitious effort in decades to directly study whether there was ever life on the now barren red planet. While the agency has completed other missions to Mars, the $2.7 billion robotic explorer, named Perseverance, carries scientific tools that will bring advanced capabilities to the search for life beyond Earth. The rover, about the size of a car, can use its sophisticated cameras, lasers that can analyze the chemical makeup of Martian rocks, and ground-penetrating radar to identify the chemical signatures of fossilized microbial life that may have thrived on Mars when it was a planet full of flowing water. Now the fun really starts, Lori Glaze, director of NASA's Planetary Science Division, said during a news conference after the landing. NASA's earlier missions showed that in the distant past some places were warm, wet and habitable. Now it is time to learn whether there were ever any microscopic inhabitants there. It's an enormous undertaking that's in front of us, and it has enormous scientific potential to really be transformative, Kenneth Williford, a deputy project scientist on the mission, said during a news conference on Wednesday. The question is, was Mars ever a living planet? Mars has been the focus of more and more interest from explorers on Earth. The United Arab Emirates and China both began orbiting the planet last month, joining an armada of European and American spacecraft already studying it from space. And private entrepreneurs are looking toward the neighboring world, with some such as Elon Musk imagining that one day perhaps humans could live there. The rover will set in motion a NASA plan that is to be carried out over the next decade, and it could bring samples from Mars back to Earth, where scientists will have even more capabilities to find something signaling that our planet is not the only place where life has ever been found. The mission will also try to make a small experimental helicopter, Ingenuity, take flight in the thin Martian atmosphere, something never accomplished before. Successful tests of this Marscopter could point the way toward new methods for searching the surface of Mars and other worlds from their skies. A successful test of the helicopter would be a true extraterrestrial Wright brothers moment, said Thomas Zurbuchen, NASA's Associate Administrator for Science. NASA has landed a series of rovers on Mars since the 1990s. Each has revolutionized human understanding of Mars. The Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which landed in 2004, followed unmistakable signs of water that flowed several billion years ago. The Curiosity rover, which arrived in 2012, quickly discovered that its location, the 96-mile-wide Gale crater, was once a freshwater lake, an environment that was clearly habitable even though it was not equipped to answer whether microbes once inhabited the lake. Perseverance, by contrast, has the tools that can search for complex carbon-based molecules that could be the remnants of past microbes. We are looking for lifelike shapes and lifelike compositions, Dr. Williford said. Chemical compositions, so the elements, the minerals, the molecules, the organic molecules that we know are associated with life. We are looking for all those things occurring together. The setting for the mission's studies is Jezero, a 30-mile-wide crater that was once a large lake filled by a river delta. The rover will crawl along the ancient delta, poring over its piles of sediments in search of those chemical signals of microbes that were extinguished as Mars turned cold and barren. But Perseverance will most likely be unable to provide definitive proof of past life. Another part of its mission is to be the first step in a complicated robotic game of pick-up sticks that will eventually bring some of the rocks back to Earth for scientists to study up close. Perseverance will drill rock samples, seal them in tubes and then drop them onto the surface. A later rover, from the European Space Agency, will retrace Perseverance's path in order to pick up the tubes and transfer them to a small rocket that will blast off to space. The samples will then be transferred to another spacecraft in orbit around Mars for the trip back to Earth, sometime in the early 2030s. Perseverance was the third robotic visitor from Earth to arrive at the Red Planet this month. Last week, two other spacecraft, Hope from the United Arab Emirates and Tianwen-1 from China, entered orbit around Mars. But NASA's spacecraft did not go into orbit first. Instead it zipped along a direct path to the surface. At 3:48 p.m. Eastern Time, controllers at the Mission Operations Center at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory near Pasadena, California, received word from Perseverance that it had entered the top of the Martian atmosphere at a speed of more than 12,000 miles per hour. The spacecraft was beginning the landing maneuvers that would bring it to a soft stop in just 7 anxiety-drenched minutes. The only uncertainty was whether it had safely arrived. in one piece or had crashed into many pieces. Another human-made crater on the surface of Mars.